Hercule Poirot and the voice that terrified the silent witness. Chapter 1. A whisper in the darkness. The sky over Gloucestershire was covered with leaden clouds when Detective Chief Inspector Garraway received the call that would mark the beginning of the most baffling case of his career. The call came from Greystone Rise Mansion, an imposing red-brick property whose turrets and terraces seemed to defy the passage of time. There, amid velvet curtains and antique tapestries, a crime had taken place that would defy common logic. Lady Margaret Willoughby, widow of the late Lord Peregrine Willoughby, had been found dead in her study. There were no signs of foul play, no traces of intruders, not even a weapon. Just a look of absolute panic frozen on her face, and a spilled glass of sherry on some papers on her desk. The family doctor spoke of a heart attack, but Garraway, a man of keen instincts and more scars on his soul than on his uniform, wasn't convinced. Even more disturbing was the witness who claimed to have heard a voice moments before the death, a witness who could not speak. Paul Hennings, the mansion's gardener of 17 years, was in the adjoining greenhouse when the incident occurred. He had seen everything through the window: Lady Margaret's sudden fall, her body shuddering, and what he described through frantic sign language as a voice from nowhere. Paul had lost his voice in a war accident in 1917. He could neither speak nor write clearly, but his face was still expressive like a mime's, and his gestures had the urgency of someone clamouring to be believed. The family was naturally dismayed. Lady Margaret left behind a considerable fortune and a small but complex inner circle. Her niece, Vivian Willoughby, a moderately renowned stage actress who had returned from Paris after a failed production. Mr. Alistair Penhaligon, Lady Margaret's personal secretary and a former ward of her late husband, and the French governess, Madame Léonie Durand, a cold and haughty figure whose devotion to routine bordered on the obsessive. Faced with the lack of physical evidence and the gardener's fragmentary testimony, Garraway, a practical man but not one who was open to the extraordinary, turned to the only mind capable of finding order in chaos. The next morning, while the dew still glistened on the greystone rose bushes, a man of medium height, with a neat moustache and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, arrived. "Inspector Garraway," he said in his distinctive Belgian accent, carefully adjusting the angle of his hat. "You were right to call me. This death, it doesn't smell natural, does it?" Poirot advanced toward the mansion with measured steps, already evaluating every angle, every silence, every shadow. Entering the office where Lady Margaret had died, he paused in front of the desk. Without touching anything, he bowed slightly. A spilled glass, crumpled papers, a stopped heart. But why so suddenly? And above all, he raised an eyebrow gravely. Why a voice for someone who can't hear the words but only feel them? The inspector looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean by that?" "Mon ami," said Poirot, turning away with a cryptic smile. "The gardener cannot speak, but yes, you can hear and die. Do you think a voice in the darkness would be enough to terrify you, if you hadn't heard it before?" And so began the dance of deduction of the most famous of detectives. Chapter 2. The Inhabitants of Greystone Rise. Hercule Poirot walked slowly down the long carpeted corridor of Greystone Rise, his sharp eyes observing every family portrait hanging on the walls and every slight imperfection in the surroundings. The silence was almost total, interrupted only by the faint creaking of the wood beneath his footsteps. It wasn't a place of mourning, but rather of containment, as if everyone knew something and no one dared to speak it. In the main hall, the 3 remaining members of the household waited reluctantly. Inspector Garraway made the introductions with his usual dryness. Mademoiselle Vivienne Willoughby, niece of the deceased, Monsieur Alistair Penhaligon, personal secretary, and Madame Léonie Durand, governess. Vivienne was the first to speak, her voice polite and distant. "I don't understand why a foreign detective was called in. The doctor already declared it a cardiac arrest." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, the sudden death of a lady in good health is always a cause for questioning, and even more so when a considerable fortune is involved." Vivienne straightened, crossing her arms. Her expression was a mixture of disdain and exhaustion. "If you're suggesting that any of us had anything to do with my aunt's death, I assure you you're wasting your time." "I never make assumptions without data, mademoiselle. It's an affront to logical order. Only the small grey cells guide us clearly." Penhaligon, a man with an angular face and a shifty gaze, intervened in a diplomatic tone. Lady Margaret had received several stressful news stories in recent weeks, changes to her will, problems with the Willoughby Foundation. Perhaps that contributed. Poirot looked at him carefully. "Oh, the will. Was it altered recently?" "Just an addendum," Penhaligon said with some discomfort. "A pledged donation to the Children's Welfare Society. It was signed 2 weeks ago." Madame Léonie, who had remained silent until then, spoke with restrained coldness. "I don't think that detail is relevant. Lady Margaret was strong, but susceptible to intense emotions. Last night she was upset. She was talking about a letter, about something she couldn't find." Poirot leaned towards her with interest. "A letter? And did you say who it was addressed to?" "No, sir. He just said, 'If this gets out, someone will come after me.'" Then she locked her desk and asked me not to bother her any more. "And May, that key. She's still missing," Inspector Garraway said with a frown. "We checked the room. Nothing." Poirot narrowed his eyes. A lost letter, a missing key, an unexplained death, and a silent witness who speaks with his eyes. Very well. Allow me now to converse with this Monsieur Hennings. The greenhouse was a sanctuary of calm and humidity, populated by ferns and orchids that Lady Margaret had devotedly cultivated. Paul Hennings, with his back to the glass, didn't seem startled when Poirot approached. The gardener was a robust man with a weathered face and sharp eyes that observed everything as if they were about to engrave it in stone. Poirot raised a hand in greeting and handed him a small notebook and pencil. "My dear monsieur, I know you can't speak, but perhaps we can find a way. May I ask you a few questions?" Paul nodded. Poirot wrote in neat strokes. "What did you hear last night before Lady Margaret fell?" Paul frowned thoughtfully, then clumsily drew a word. "Voice." Poirot, man or woman? Paul wrote, women. Then he hesitated and wrote another word underneath, but different. Poirot tilted his head. Different? How? As if it came from far away. Paul nodded vigorously. Then he took a separate sheet of paper and wrote slowly, as if the voice weren't in the room. but inside it. Poirot felt a shudder run down his spine. A disembodied voice, like an echo that doesn't need physical space. "No, mon ami," he murmured. "It's not a ghost we're looking for. It's someone who knows fear all too well." The house. Poirot paused on the threshold of Lady Margaret's study. The desk had not yet been opened. Garraway watched impatiently. "Do you think that letter really existed?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Oh, yes. And someone in this house has already found it, or is afraid someone else will. And when you play with fear, Inspector, you end up whispering in the dark, so someone else dies of panic." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, as if watching the pieces of the puzzle slowly turn and begin to fit together. "Tomorrow I will question each of them, not for what they did, but for what friend." And with that, he retired to his room, leaving behind him an atmosphere thicker than the clouds over Gloucestershire. Chapter 3. The Truths Between the Lines. The next morning, a light mist covered the countryside surrounding Greystone Rise. Poirot, dressed in his light grey suit and his infallible, perfectly knotted tie, ate his breakfast with the meticulousness of someone solving an invisible puzzle. He silently observed the servants' gestures, the rhythm of their footsteps in the corridor, the way the crockery was removed. Every routine, every silence was for him a trace. "Mademoiselle Vivienne will be the first," he said, after carefully placing his cup on its saucer. "I think distance is an easy mask to use, but not always effective." The young actress received him in the library, where she was leafing through a copy of Jane Eyre without real interest. Seeing the detective enter, he closed the book with a sigh. "Guess I can't refuse this, can I?" Poirot smiled politely. "It's not an obligation, mademoiselle. But it is an opportunity. Who better than you to understand how an emotion is hidden beneath a gesture?" She frowned, but her look wasn't one of annoyance. It was one of calculation. "My aunt and I weren't close. I came here 3 weeks ago out of moral obligation, not affection. We got along, with difficulty. And why this difficulty?" Vivienne hesitated before answering. "Because she was strict, cold. She never approved of my career. She said theatre was a refined form of emotional prostitution." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "That's a very harsh sentence. Did you feel hurt?" "No more than usual. I was used to wounds with lace gloves." Poirot leaned slightly towards her. "The night she died, did you see her? Did you speak to her?" Vivienne looked away. "We exchanged a few words before dinner. She was upset, but that wasn't unusual. She was talking to herself. She said things like, 'She knows, she knows.' She didn't explain what she meant. And you didn't ask. I thought it was delusional, or theatre." Poirot stood up gently. "Thank you, mademoiselle. Sometimes it's not what is said that reveals the truth, but what is deliberately ignored." The second interview was with Alistair Penhaligon, who was waiting in the late Lord Willoughby's office, surrounded by mahogany, bookshelves, neatly arranged files, and an atmosphere of iron control. Dressed in a three-piece suit and wearing round glasses, he looked more like an accountant than a personal secretary. "Monsieur Penhaligon," Poirot began, "you knew Lady Margaret's habits very well, oui?" "Like the back of my hand. I worked alongside. Him for 10 years. I handled his correspondence, his appointments, the foundation, practically everything. Then perhaps you can tell me, do you remember any suspicious letters you received recently? Penhaligon hesitated. I received many. Recently there was one, yes, anonymous, poorly worded. It said that the truth would soon come out. He burned it in front of me, saying it wasn't worth the ink it was written with. And you didn't try to find out its origin. It wasn't my place. And to be frank with you, Monsieur Poirot, Lady Margaret has been different lately. Forgetful, irritable, as if she were expecting something terrible or revealing. Penhaligon narrowed his eyes, as if assessing the meaning behind the question. I guess to her they were both the same. Poirot stood up with a bow. Thank you. Perhaps later I'll need your help reconstructing certain schedules. I'll ask for your personal notebook. The third interview with Madame Léonie Durand took place in the sewing room. Surrounded by lace and embroidery, the governess seemed carved from marble. Her movements were slow and calculated, as if every gesture deserved careful consideration. Madame Durand, were you aware of Lady Margaret's nocturnal habits? Until 10 at night, yes. Then he would retire and not be disturbed except in emergencies. And have you noticed anything unusual in his behavior recently? He didn't sleep well. He paced the halls. He turned lamps on and off. One night he even left his office door open. Poirot stared at her. Have you ever heard that voice the gardener spoke of? The woman blinked as if she hadn't expected that question. No, but one night I heard sobbing. Very faint. It was coming from the study. When I went to look, I found her standing in front of the mirror, muttering words I didn't understand. And you didn't ask? It is not my custom to interfere in the personal affairs of my employers. Poirot stood up and walked to a small table where a silver thimble gleamed in the light. Madam, you are a woman of restraint. But even the most precise watches stop if an internal part is loose. The woman watched him without changing her expression. And you, Monsieur Poirot, what do you think is wrong here? Poirot turned slowly towards her with a slight smile. Not a piece, madame, but a truth. Back in his room, Poirot placed 3 objects on his table. A sheet of paper, written by Paul Hennings, a portrait of Lady Margaret in her youth, and an unannounced letter that Garraway had retrieved from the archives, apparently overlooked, written in pale blue ink and unsigned. He read it slowly, his lips barely moving. The truth can be buried under 1,000 flowers, but it will always have roots that pierce the earth. Poirot leaned back in his armchair, crossing his fingers over his stomach. Someone in this house was afraid that Lady Margaret would speak, and someone helped her. No, do it. His eyes shone with determination. And tomorrow I'll have everyone say something without saying a single word. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Broken Mirror. That afternoon, as the mist began to dissipate and a pale sun filtered timidly through the stained-glass windows of Greystone Rise, Poirot asked Garraway for a detailed review of Lady Margaret's office inventory, including a complete list of items that had disappeared or changed location since the night of her death. The inspector, although somewhat exasperated by the Belgian's demands, obeyed, not because he believed in the superstitions of disembodied voices, but because he had already seen Poirot transform tiny details into devastating revelations. Meanwhile, Poirot headed back to the greenhouse, not to question Paul Hennings this time, but to observe him. The gardener was on his knees repotting a white peony with careful, almost reverent movements. Poirot stood silently at a distance, watching the man work. Then, as gently as a violinist tunes a string, he approached and handed him a sheet of paper folded in 4. On it, he had written a different question than the previous ones. Did you know about the relationship between Lady Margaret and her husband beyond what was said in public? Paul looked up slowly, his expression somewhere between surprise and resignation. He dried his hands on his canvas apron, then wrote on the back. He treated her coldly. There were things that weren't said but were known. I saw her cry many times when he wasn't looking. Poirot nodded gravely. So, it's not just the present that poisons this house, but the past as well. Before leaving, Poirot added something else to the paper. Did you ever hear Lady Margaret speak of an unacknowledged son or daughter? Paul read, hesitated, and then wrote a single word. Yeah. Poirot did not smile, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had just heard a discordant note in a symphony. That evening, Poirot requested that all members of the inner circle dine together in the main dining room. It wasn't a formal imposition like one of those final meetings he usually reserved for his conclusions, but rather an invitation disguised as courtesy. Vivienne arrived in a simple black dress, without makeup. Penhaligon showed up in the same suit she'd worn since day one, though carefully ironed. Léonie Durand arrived in her imperturbable grey suit, her gaze as steady as ever. During dinner, Poirot talked about trivialities. The weather, his travels, his aversion to clutter in cupboards. But during his pauses, he observed. He took note of every gesture, every exchange of glances, every knife that touched the plate with a slight tremor. At one point, without warning, he dropped his napkin on the floor. Penhaligon bent down to pick it up. Vivienne didn't even flinch. Léonie looked at her with disdain, but didn't move. "Ah, thank you, Monsieur Penhaligon," said Poirot, placing the napkin back on his knees. "Always so helpful." Then he took a small envelope out of his jacket and left it on the table. I found a letter, or rather, a copy of the letter Lady Margaret feared. The original was probably destroyed, but someone in this house received a transcript. Don't ask me how I know. I'll just tell you that the paper had a watermark from the Hotel L'Étoile in Paris. Does that sound familiar? Silence. Léonie frowned barely perceptibly. Vivienne leaned forward. What did he say? Poirot held each of their gazes. She said Lady Margaret was keeping a secret, something that, if known, would ruin the Willoughby legacy, a child born out of wedlock, likely born during the years her husband was travelling on business in North Africa. Penhaligon shifted in his chair. Is that confirmed? Poirot shook his head. No, just hinted at, but enough to provoke fear or anger. Enough that someone would want to silence her before she publicly confirmed it. Are you suggesting, Léonie said coldly, that one of us killed her for a letter whose authenticity you can't even prove? Poirot calmly interlaced his fingers. I'm saying that someone made her feel like she was about to lose control. that someone, knowing her emotional fragility, planted a voice that only one of you knew could make her collapse. Ah, and what would that voice be? Vivian asked sceptically. Poirot stood up. His tone remained gentle, but his words weighed like lead. Not just any voice, but one that seemed to be that of someone dead. A recording, perhaps a montage of words from the past, played at exactly the right moment, just enough for Lady Margaret to believe she was hearing Lord Willoughby himself. A shudder ran through the table. "And if my hypothesis is correct," added Poirot, picking up his hat, "tomorrow morning I shall ask to inspect the gramophone kept in the attic. I believe that there, among the dust and cobwebs, we shall find something more than old music." Poirot left the room without looking back. But at the threshold he stopped and muttered to himself, "The voices of the past are sometimes directed by modern hands." Chapter 5. The Gramophone in the Attic. The next morning, while the dew still lingered on the cornices of Greystone Rise, Poirot climbed into the attic, accompanied by Inspector Garraway and a young lock-picking officer. The attic had been locked for years, or so it was said. A rusty padlock hung from the trapdoor in the ceiling like a forgotten relic. The agent had picked the lock in a few minutes and pushed the trapdoor upward. A smell of old wood and damp cloth wafted up from the darkness. Poirot climbed in carefully, politely declining assistance. "Monsieur Garraway, please observe and not interfere," he said as he moved through the dusty space. "Nay, here, every object has its place, and every movement is a clue." The attic was filled with trunks, frames covered with sheets, and boxes of yellowed documents. In one corner, partially covered by a linen blanket, rested a gramophone with a wide bass and a polished horn. Poirot gently removed the cloth. The device seemed in good condition, although the needles were visibly worn. Beside it, in a small wooden box, lay a collection of records, some without labels. Poirot picked them up one by one, examining the almost faded inscriptions on the inside edges. He stopped at one that didn't bear a trademark. "This, Inspector, isn't a released record. It was probably recorded at home, using a similar device. See this irregular groove? This is typical of recordings made with homemade equipment. Typical of the 1920s and 1930s. You mean someone recorded something? Right here? Exactly. And I bet it wasn't music." Wearing thin gloves that he took from his pocket, Poirot placed the record on the gramophone's turntable. He adjusted the needle with extreme precision and turned the crank. Then he paused, looking at the inspector seriously. "Prepare your ear, mon ami. Not for the obvious, but for what they want that sounds obvious." The needle descended. A faint click, then a pause, then a voice, deep, slightly distorted by the rudimentary technology, but clear. "Margaret, you can't escape what you did. They'll come for you. They always do." Poirot closed his eyes. His tone, though limited by technique, had a strangely familiar cadence, calculated pauses, sententious intonation. "It's a construct," he said quietly. "Voice fragments, taken from letters dictated by the late Lord Willoughby. Someone took past recordings, probably from old discs or cylinders, and pieced them together to construct this artificial message. Ingenious and cruel." Garraway frowned. "So, Lady Margaret heard this before she died? Poirot nodded. Probably hidden in her office or activated remotely from the hallway. It would be enough for her to believe it was her late husband's voice. Imagine the echo of an authority figure returning from the afterlife to condemn her. And why believe it? Garraway asked. What guilt did he have that made him accept that threat? Poirot gently lifted the disc. That, Inspector, is what we're trying to uncover. But now we have a new clue. The culprit not only knew about the illegitimate child, he also knew how to manipulate deep emotions. This isn't a physical murder. It's an induced murder. A crime of suggestion, constructed with psychological precision. Back in the mansion's drawing room, Poirot gathered the guests. Vivienne, Alastair, and Leonie sat tensely as the detective placed the gramophone on the centre table. This is the voice Lady Margaret heard the night of her death, a voice constructed to resemble that of the late Lord Willoughby. Which of you had access to his private recordings? No one responded at first, until Penhaligon spoke. Me. The audio archive was in a foundation vault. Recordings of speeches, dictated letters. Lady Margaret decided to keep them as a memento. Poirot nodded. And who else knew of its existence? Just the immediate family. And maybe Miss Vivienne. She helped catalogue the library during her 1934 visit. Vivienne turned, slowly. That was years ago. I didn't even know tapes still existed. Poirot then turned to Leonie. Madam, you were the one who mentioned hearing sobs the night before the death. Isn't that right? Yes, sir. And you didn't hear the voice? No, just the sobs. Poirot looked at each of them equally. Then let me formulate a hypothesis. Someone spread a rumour of an illegitimate child. Someone feared that Lady Margaret would confirm the truth, disinheriting the current beneficiaries. That someone decided to induce her death not with poison, nor with knives, but with fear, with a voice. He looked at the gramophone again. And in the world of sounds, appearances are as deceptive as in the world of images. When the meeting ended, Poirot walked alone through the garden. Paul Hennings was waiting for him by the box hedge, as if he knew the detective would come. Poirot handed him a new sheet of paper. On it were written only 2 words. Were you the son? Paul looked at the paper. Then, very slowly, he shook his head, and he wrote, "But I knew him." Poirot put the note in his jacket. The air was colder than before, but in his mind the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. So, it's not the past that kills, he murmured, but what Un decides to do with it. And with that thought, Poirot turned to return to the house. There would soon be another conversation, and then another revelation, because the crime was not yet completely discovered. Chapter 6. Shadows at the Willoughby Foundation. That afternoon, Poirot asked to be taken to the south wing of the house, which, until recently, housed the administrative headquarters of the Willoughby Foundation, the philanthropic project with which Lady Margaret had sought, in her own words, to redress certain wrongs of the past. The offices, though clean and tidy, had an air of neglect. The death of its founder had left more than an emotional void. It had paralyzed key decisions, frozen accounts, and suspended donations. Poirot walked among metal filing cabinets, chairs upholstered in cracked leather, and shelves filled with precisely labelled folders. He was accompanied by Alistair Penhaligon, who, despite his usual composure, seemed more tense than in previous days. "Were these your personal files, monsieur?" asked Poirot, stopping in front of a locked cabinet. "No, only Foundation files. The personal ones were in his office, although he also used to keep certain documents here, when he didn't want them to be easily found." "Did you have exclusive access to these rooms?" "Not exclusively. Madame Léonie also had a key. For security reasons." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Madame Léonie? How curious. Wasn't your job to instruct, not to administer? She also handled Lady Margaret's private accounts. She did everything with almost military rigour." Poirot made a mental note of that statement. "Then the trail we're looking for is likely here, not in the library or the bedroom." Penhaligon took out a bunch of keys and opened the central filing, or cabinet. Inside, the folders were sorted by year and type of activity. Poirot stopped at a section marked Special Cases, Bequests and Private Donations. He quickly scanned the folder titles. One of them had a name that hadn't been mentioned aloud until now. Case R. Education Fund. Closed. Confidential. Poirot slid the folder across the desk and opened it. Inside were a series of typewritten letters, a bank receipt for a Swiss account, and a sheet of black ink handwritten in Lady Margaret's angular handwriting. "The child never knew who his mother was. It must remain that way. But I want to make sure he has an education, a home and dignity, not an inheritance, just justice." "Monsieur Penhaligon," Poirot said quietly, "why was this file never mentioned?" The secretary cleared his throat, visibly and uncomfortable, because it was closed more than 15 years ago. The beneficiary disappeared. He never claimed the full fund. Did he disappear, or did someone make sure he couldn't find what belonged to him? Penhaligon did not reply. That evening, Poirot asked Garraway to gather the suspects in the green room on the ground floor. This wasn't yet the final confrontation, but rather a strategic first briefing. This time, the detective sat by the fire, letting the flames create moving shadows on the faces of those present. Vivian seemed uneasy, though she concealed it with cynicism. Léonie kept her back straight as if defying the chair to tame her. Penhaligon looked pale. "I've found evidence of a fund reserved for a young man born out of wedlock. The money was deposited in a fictitious name, but managed by Lady Margaret herself. Only 2 people could have known of its existence, her trusted trustee or someone with access to her private papers." Nobody spoke. Poirot continued. "This young man was raised far from here. He never claimed his inheritance. But Lady Margaret feared he would. Not because it was a crime, but because his name, his legacy, his reputation would be exposed to public speculation." Vivian pressed her lips together. "And do you think someone killed for that?" "Not directly. Someone decided to induce the collapse, to make Lady Margaret believe her secret had been leaked, that voices from the past had returned. And who benefited most if she died before changing her will again?" Penhaligon suddenly stood up. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm merely suggesting." Poirot said with almost icy calm that you had the means, the knowledge, and the motivation. You knew where to find the recordings. You knew of the existence of the fund. You knew, moreover, that the will would be revised in the coming days to grant the entire fortune to the foundation, not to the current heirs. Leonie narrowed her eyes. It wasn't Alistair. Poirot turned to her. Oh, no, no, because I was the one who recorded the voice. A thick silence fell over the room. Garraway sat up instinctively. Explain yourself, he said in a tense voice. Leonie settled into the armchair, like someone who has finally allowed herself to rest. Lady Margaret confided everything to me. She knew the boy was her late husband's son by another woman. She raised him at a distance, out of guilt and shame. But before she died, she wanted to acknowledge it, and I couldn't allow it. Vivian murmured, because that boy wasn't a stranger. He was my son. The revelation fell like a hammer. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, not in surprise, but as if confirming a suspicion. And so you chose to cause Lady Margaret's death? To protect him? To protect us both? Leonie said, her gaze steady. I knew she'd never fully accept him. She'd only burden him with her guilt. I preferred to erase the problem. A voice, a suggestion, nothing more. Poirot stood up, very slowly. No, madame, it was nothing more. It was a crime. One of the coldest I've ever seen. Because it didn't just kill the body. It killed the chance for redemption. That evening, Poirot wrote in his travel notebook, in his usual neat, round handwriting, a crime without blood, a murder without a weapon, a mother who chooses fear over the truth, and a victim who died for a secret she was about to reveal. There was still one more conversation to go, one more, and the true face of the lost son had not yet been revealed. Chapter 7. The Man Who Never Knocked on the Door. At dawn the next day, Poirot was already up, perfectly dressed, his moustache impeccably combed, and his thoughts as orderly as his socks. Through his bedroom window, he looked out onto the garden bordering the east. Wing of Greystone Rise. There, standing by the box hedge, Paul Hennings waited, as if he knew his silence had begun to turn noisy. Poirot descended silently, crossed the corridor with his short, quick steps, and went out to meet the gardener, without a word. Paul greeted him with a slight nod. Poirot, in response, handed him a new piece of paper. Leonie says he was your son. Did you know that was the case? Paul read the sentence slowly. Then, with a calmness that only very tired men possess, he wrote, No, but I suspected it. Poirot waited. Paul added, She never told me. She just asked me not to talk, not to ask. That's how I lived, watching it from afar. So, monsieur, said Poirot in a low voice, almost like a prayer, the only person who knew the whole truth has disappeared with his lie. Paul wrote something else. He came here a month ago. He introduced himself as a journalist. He asked for his mother. Poirot looked up as if an invisible shadow had just crossed the garden. A journalist? Here, a month ago. Paul nodded. Poirot took out his notebook and, for the first time, jotted down a name that had been absent from the entire story until now. The nameless visitor. Hours later, Poirot asked Garraway to investigate the visits recorded at the property over the past month. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, provided a notebook in which all outside visits were noted. We only received 2 people outside our usual circle. A Reverend Chilton, Fletcher said, who came to ask for a donation, and a young journalist, dark-skinned, thin, with glasses. He gave his name as Allen, but didn't leave a surname, nor a card. He met with Madame Léonie. She said it was just a chat for a commemorative publication. Poirot leafed through the register. And when exactly did this happen? April 17th, Poirot slowly closed the notebook. Exactly 9 days before Lady Margaret's death. With this new information, Poirot asked to be allowed to review Lady Margaret's private correspondence. Penhaligon, although visibly suspicious after recent events, agreed. Several envelopes were found in a lacquered wooden box, all with recent dates. Most were letters from the Foundation, but one, with no visible sender, and on plain paper, caught the detective's attention. The letter said, "Mrs. Willoughby, I am the son of the woman you silenced. I am not looking for money, only the truth. I will come to see you. I will not say my name until I know you are willing to admit what you did. I do not want revenge, only justice. Unsigned, no return address. Just those sentences, written in bold but uneven handwriting." Poirot stood motionless for several minutes. Then he murmured, "That was the trigger, not the threat, but the possibility of reparation. Something that Madame Léonie found unacceptable. That evening, Poirot asked to speak privately with Vivian Willoughby. He found her in the music room, sitting at the piano, clumsily playing a Chopin nocturne. "Did you know that a young man visited the house a month ago, mademoiselle? A young man? What kind of young man?" "One who came looking for his mother." Vivian paused her hands on the keys. "No, I didn't know that, but now that you mention it, I remember that Léonie was more nervous those days. She locked herself in the office a lot. She burned several papers. She said they were old, unnecessary things." Poirot nodded. "And have you burned anything recently, mademoiselle?" Vivienne turned around with a wry smile. "Just my chances at reconciliation with my aunt. I also came here for one last chance. Not to get money, but to show her I wasn't a failure." Poirot looked at the score in front of her. It was annotated by hand. "Are you the one who wrote it?" "Yes. It's a fragment of a piece I composed years ago, when I was a student in Lyon. Aunt hated it. She said it was melancholy without purpose." Poirot bowed, but perhaps that melancholy contains more truth than all the words spoken in this house. That night, Poirot returned to his room and wrote a note, which he then hid in his suitcase. The true son came. He asked, he didn't demand. And he was silenced by fear. The gardener saw the sadness. The governess knew the danger. And the lady of the house died not of guilt, but of uncertainty. The weapon was the unspoken word. The crime, a touchless orchestration. But every false note resonates more loudly when it's held too long. He knew the next step was crucial. The truth was complete in his mind, but not yet revealed. Because like any well-tuned concert, the last chord had to arrive at exactly the right moment. Chapter 8. A Name Among the Ashes. The next morning, while the rest of the household was still asleep, Poirot went down to Lady Margaret's study, where the fire had been lit very early. Inspector Garraway was waiting for him there, his shoulders slightly hunched and his brow furrowed from his lack of sleep. "You said it wasn't a traditional crime, Poirot," he said hoarsely. "But if you ask me, this has become an emotional labyrinth. How are you going to prove it to a jury?" Poirot smiled faintly as he approached the hearth. Among the extinguished embers, blackened scraps of paper remained, barely legible. "You don't always need a weapon, Inspector. Sometimes all it takes is an unwanted truth and the will to manipulate someone who can't face it. But look, there are still traces." He took a pair of metal tweezers from his desk and carefully removed a sheet of paper, burned only around the edges. The centre still contained a half-written sentence in blue ink. "I'll agree to talk if I can see her face. I'm not interested in the last name. I just want to know if she ever thought of me as anything more than a consequence." Poirot placed it on a metal tray. "This was a letter Lady Margaret never answered," he said regretfully. "Not out of fear, nor time, but someone did read it and acted to prevent it from being answered." Garraway crossed his arms. "And you think that someone was Madame Léonie?" "I'm sure of it, but there's still one piece missing." Poirot went to the desk. From a side compartment he took out a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a diary, but a discreet, almost methodical record. Dates, names, deliveries. On the last page, in shaky handwriting, one could read, "April 19th. P has agreed to help me find him. I don't know if I'll recognize him, but if I look into his eyes, I'll know. I don't want to die without that certainty." Poirot closed the notebook delicately. Lady Margaret was going to meet him. She had given the order to Paul. That's why they called him the silent witness. Not because of what he saw, but because of what knew that was about to happen. That afternoon, Poirot asked for a final meeting to be held in the mansion's central gallery. It was a long room flanked by portraits of the Willoughbys, whose painted gazes seemed to judge from the walls. Everyone came. Vivienne, Penhaligon, Léonie, this time without her usual composure, and Paul Hennings, who stood in a corner, as if his presence were a shadow rather than a witness. Poirot, his hands clasped behind his back, paced slowly back and forth before speaking. This was no ordinary murder. No one poisoned Lady Margaret. No one placed a gun in her hand. But someone fabricated a situation in which her death became inevitable. Someone knew that one sentence, one voice, one implied threat would be enough to stop her heart. He stopped in front of Léonie. "You, madam, recorded the voice. You confessed to it. But it wasn't an impulse. It was a calculated decision. You knew he would come. You knew she would hesitate, and you couldn't allow it. Léonie didn't deny it, but she didn't speak either." Poirot continued, "However, you didn't act alone, because someone had to deliver the recordings, place the gramophone in the office, and make sure it was turned on at the precise time." Everyone looked at Penhaligon. He looked down. "What was left for me?" he murmured. "If Lady Margaret changed the will, the foundation would die. All the work, everything we had built together, would be lost. I didn't want to kill her, just scare her. Stop her." Poirot nodded slowly. and in that shared fear, you and Madame Léonie joined forces. She for her son, you for your legacy. You used the voice of a dead man and the silence of a gardener to construct a perfect trap. Vivienne stood up straight. And the boy? Where is he? Poirot turned to her. I'll look for him, because someone in this house must. Lady Margaret wanted to make amends for the past. She was deprived of that opportunity, but not of her intention, and that intention deserves justice. Paul Hennings took out a small sheet of paper, folded in 4. He handed it to Poirot. On it was a name, Alan Roux. Poirot read it silently. Then he looked up, and for the first time since arriving at Greyston Rise, smiled sweetly. Thank you, sir. Sometimes the truth finds its way, even through those who have been forced into silence. That night, Poirot put the note with the name in his wallet. In his notebook he wrote, "The crime was planned, the guilt was shared, but the greatest pain was denying a son his right to be regarded with humanity. Lady Margaret, at the last moment, wanted to do it, and in that desire lies her redemption." The storm had passed, but the echo of the false voice still resonated in the walls, and Poirot knew that in the end the most subtle crime is not the one committed with intention, but the one born from the fear of loving unconditionally. Chapter 9. The Echo of Forbidden Names. 3 days later, a letter postmarked from Marseille arrived at the Langham Hotel in London, where Poirot had stayed after his stay at Greystone Rise. The letter, on cheap paper and smudging ink, contained only 3 lines. I heard you asked questions. I don't want to be found. Tell her, if she ever thought of me, that I don't hate her. I just wanted to know if you ever regretted it. Don't. A.R. Poirot read it without expression. Then slowly he folded it and placed it between the pages of a copy of Sentimental Education which he used to take on his travels. The silence in his room was profound, broken only by the grandfather clock on the wall. But in Poirot's mind the pieces were still moving. That young man had fled, yes, but not from the scandal, but from the possibility of discovering a truth that was perhaps worse than the lie, that he had been forgotten, not through negligence, but through calculation, that his life was the product of cold decisions, and his existence a rift that no one wanted to face. Meanwhile, at Greystone Rise, Detective Inspector Garraway had taken formal statements. Madame Léonie was taken into custody for her involvement in an induced homicide, not for the direct act, but for orchestrating the elements that precipitated the death. The recording, the fear, the psychological manipulation. Penhaligon, for his part, was summoned to appear for accessory after the fact and obstruction. Although his involvement was more indirect, his silence and calculated cooperation made him an accomplice. Vivienne Willoughby didn't press charges. Instead, she retreated to a nearby country house, saying she needed to learn to remember her aunt without the poison of the last few weeks. Shortly after, Poirot received a handwritten letter from her. Monsieur Poirot, I've started playing your nocturne, not to be heard, but to hear myself. For the first time, I feel I have a story I'm not ashamed of. Thank you for teaching me not to fear truths that don't get applause. Poirot put the letter away with a slight smile. The human soul, mon ami, he had told Garraway before leaving, is not organized like a library. But if you listen to it, it reveals hidden chapters. Once in London, Poirot decided to visit a small music store in Camden that sold old vinyl records. He had received an anonymous tip indicating that someone had recently submitted an unlabeled record for a technical evaluation. The clerk, a young man with a crooked moustache and a checked vest, recognized him from the description. Yes, sir. He was a thin young man with glasses. He didn't buy anything. He just asked if he could have a recording copied. He said it was to preserve a memory. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And he did it? No. I told him I'd need more information, and he disappeared. But he left me an address in case I changed my mind. Here it is. He handed Poirot a yellowed card with an address in Lyon. Poirot nodded silently. Then he bought a record without even looking at it, just out of courtesy, and said goodbye with his usual courteous bow. Back at the hotel, Poirot spread a map on his desk. He drew a line in pencil from London to Marseille, then to Lyon. It wasn't an itinerary of pursuit or even of search. Rather, it was a way of honouring Lady Margaret's original intention, to close the loop. At the bottom of his luggage, he still had the leather-bound notebook containing the lady's private notes. There was one last sentence written on a loose sheet of paper, folded between the pages. If I ever look into his eyes, I'll know who I really am. Poirot closed his eyes. The weight of those words lay not in their sadness, but in their clarity. Lady Margaret wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was seeking reflection, the same one so many people avoid in the mirrors of the past. That evening, Poirot sat by the Langham fireplace, reading slowly, not from his novel, but from a new letter that had just arrived. This time, written in firmer handwriting. Monsieur Poirot, you don't know me, but I saw you at Greystone. You looked at everyone as if you knew more than you were letting on, and now I understand. Thank you for not saying my name out loud. I don't want the world to know that. But thank you for showing that, for a moment, someone looked at me without judgment. A. Poirot closed the letter and exhaled deeply. The case was solved. The culprits had been unmasked. Justice, in its institutional form, took its course. But in Poirot's heart, what remained was not the deductive triumph, but the fragility of what is left unspoken. The real crime hadn't been hiding a child, nor inducing a death. It had been denying the possibility of love before it was too late. Chapter 10. The House Where No One Called Again. A week later, under a fine rain that seemed to erase the outlines of London's facades, Poirot returned to Greystone Rise for the last time. The mansion was empty. The shutters were closed, the garden unmown, and the echoes of ancient voices still trapped within the walls. Inspector Garraway had informed him that the legal proceedings had moved quickly. Madame Léonie would be tried for culpable homicide by psychological manipulation, while Penhaligon faced lesser charges of passive complicity and obstruction of justice. But for Poirot, that was just the surface. He entered with the key that had been temporarily given to him by the Foundation. He walked down the central corridor, that hallway that for days had been the scene of veiled suspicions, of long, lingering glances, of gestures that concealed rifts. Now only silence remained. He climbed the stairs and stopped in front of Lady Margaret's study. The gramophone had been removed, the desk was closed, the walls were stripped of their pictures. All that remained was an oval, gilt-framed mirror, hanging between two stained-glass windows. He approached it slowly. "This is where she used to stare," he said softly. "Not to marvel, but to remember." He looked at himself, his reflection intact and tidy as ever, and yet, in his eyes, one could see the weight of a story that didn't end with prison or formal justice. It ended with an absence, with a name that wouldn't be spoken aloud, with a young man who would never return. From his inside jacket pocket, he took an envelope. Inside was a copy of Lady Margaret's revised will, found in a secondary safe deposit box, forgotten in the administrative wing. It wasn't signed, but it was dated and written in her own hand. In it, Lady Margaret expressed her intention to transfer her entire estate not to the foundation, but to an anonymous trust intended for the beneficiary named as A.R., not legally binding. But for Poirot, more than enough. Downstairs, in the abandoned greenhouse, he found Paul Hennings, not working, but simply sitting with a notebook in his lap. Seeing him, he sat up and greeted him with a sober nod. Poirot sat down next to him. He took out the will and handed it to her. It was never formalized, but she wrote it, and that's enough. Paul read silently, his lips pursed slightly, as if he were holding back a long emotion. Then he wrote, "He will never know." "Perhaps not," Poirot admitted, "but you do, and that's more than many people get." Paul wrote something else. "What will you do with the envelope?" Poirot took it out of his jacket and held it up to the light. It contained no money or official documents, just a short letter, one of Lady Margaret's last, which was never sent. "Alan, I don't know if I'm worthy of asking for forgiveness, but if you ever doubt your worth, remember this. You weren't a mistake. You were my most beloved silence." Poirot put the letter back. "I'll send it, not to a specific address, but I'll get it into hands that will know how to read it." 2 days later, in a small community centre in Lyon, a young librarian found an envelope with no return address, sealed with old-fashioned wax. He opened it suspiciously. He read the letter. Then, without knowing why, he tucked it into the pages of a notebook he usually carried in his suitcase. He never spoke of it, but from that day on, he stopped signing his reviews as Alan R. and began using simply A. In London, Poirot retired to his apartment in Whitehaven Mansions. He polished his shoes, he straightened his ties, he reviewed his notebook once more. On the last page he wrote, "The voice that terrified the silent witness wasn't a scream or a threat. It was the voice of the past, manipulated by fear. The crime wasn't physical, but emotional, a symphony of secrets orchestrated to prevent redemption. But amid the shadows, a reflection survived." He closed his notebook, poured himself a cup of herbal tea, and sat down in his favourite armchair by the window. The case was solved, not because the guilty party had been punished, but because a voice had been given to those who had been unable to speak, and for Hercule Poirot, that was justice. Chapter 11. The Last Trace of Ashes. Weeks passed. Spring crept slowly into London, painting the parks in shades of green and the streets with a patina of fresh light. But in Hercule Poirot's heart, One thread remained untied. The Lady Margaret Willoughby case had been officially closed. Madame Léonie had pleaded guilty before the judge, and Penhaligon had avoided prison in exchange for the return of all the embezzled funds. The newspapers spoke of a death induced by a voice from the past, with headlines as dramatic as they were inaccurate. But Poirot wasn't interested in the headlines. What worried him was what had been said. One morning she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Rowena Albridge, an old friend of Lady Margaret's and an honorary member of the Willoughby Foundation, showed up at her apartment unannounced. She was dressed in modest mourning, but her eyes were lively and bright. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation, "I have come to deliver something to you. An object that Lady Margaret entrusted to me 2 years ago, with the instruction that I was only to return it if she died under questionable circumstances." From her bag she took a small mahogany box, elegantly closed with a brass clasp. Poirot opened it leisurely. Inside was a signet ring, the Willoughby family crest engraved on onyx, and a letter, carefully folded. Poirot unfolded it. "If you're reading this, then I failed to protect him. I'm not talking about Paul. I'm talking about the other one, the one who never knew who he was. His real name doesn't matter. His truth is in his eyes. If he ever asks, show him this." Below was a sentence that seemed written more forcefully, as if it had been added in a moment of agitation. "I was his mother, and I could never say it." Poirot closed his eyes and sighed deeply. "Thank you, madam. This confirms what I already suspected, but it also raises one last question." "Which?" Poirot stood up and walked slowly to the window. The city vibrated in the distance, indifferent. Then he turned around, his expression completely serious. "Where is he?" Mrs. Albridge looked confused. "The young man?" "Yes. We know he was at Greystone, that he spoke to Paul, that he left letters, that he sent replies. But his current whereabouts remain unknown. And if someone else knew of his existence, someone with other intentions, they could try to use him, claim part of the estate, blackmail, the foundation." Mrs. Albridge nodded slowly, understanding. "So you plan to keep looking for him?" "No." Poirot smiled slightly. "I've found him. Or rather, he's found me. Only he hasn't let himself be seen. Yet." That evening, Poirot returned to his most intimate habit, organizing his thoughts on paper. He took out his notebook of solved cases and titled the final entry in black ink. "Case, the voice that terrified the silent witness." Under that heading, he wrote the following: "The young man never sought money or revenge. Only one certainty, that his existence had not been a faceless accident. In that desire so human and so invisible lay the true heart of this crime. It wasn't fear that killed Lady Margaret. It was guilt, subtle, slow, precise like a scentless poison." Then he turned the page and started a new entry. Not for Scotland Yard, not for the court, but for himself. The boy now lives under another name. He has been offered a position in a library in Avignon. There, among books no one reads and voices no one hears, he will build his own silence. I will not disturb him. I will not seek him out. But every time I see a white peony, I will remember that not all mistakes end in tragedy. Some are redeemed by choice. Poirot closed the notebook with a slight sigh. Then, from his inside pocket, he took the signet ring and placed it inside a box. He wouldn't mail it. He would leave it in a small bookstore in Lyon, in the hands of an old bibliophile colleague, with a simple note, to A, when he is ready to receive it. Days later, in that same bookstore, a discreet-looking young man, wearing new glasses and without the grey coat that had accompanied him on his first trip to England, received a box with no return address. Inside, the ring and the note. He read the perfect handwriting. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he smiled. At Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot poured himself a cup of hot chocolate, settled into his armchair, and after a moment's pause, murmured, "It's over." But in his heart, he knew it wasn't so. Only the past had come to rest. Chapter 12. The Memory That Didn't Want to Sleep. Weeks turned into months, and the Willoughby case was slowly pushed from the pages of the newspapers. New scandals, wars on the fringes of the continent, and rumours of political unrest eventually swallowed up the space once occupied by that mysterious death in the Gloucestershire mansion. But Hercule Poirot did not forget. One rainy November afternoon, while organising his personal files with his usual meticulousness, he found a small box among the shelves, labelled only with an initial A. E. M. He opened it. Inside, a collection of documents related to the case, exchanged letters, Lady Margaret's medical reports, bank statements from the Willoughby Foundation, and, in a separate envelope, a set of old newspaper clippings, seemingly unrelated to the rest. Poirot studied them again, this time with a more introspective lens. One of the articles, dated more than 2 decades earlier, recounted a fire at an orphanage in North Africa. 3 children had died. 1 had disappeared. The orphanage belonged to a British philanthropic organisation linked to the Willoughbys. The names were vague, but one appeared repeatedly, House of Hope. Poirot frowned. No, this is no coincidence. The next day, she took the train to Oxford to consult the archives of colonial charities. There, in a storeroom of faded stationery, she found a partial report, a list of children registered under pseudonyms, along with dates of admission and medical conditions. One of the names had been crossed out, but the writing was still visible. Antoine R. Poirot felt a shudder. Alan Roux. Antoine aren't a made-up name, just a disguise for English phonetics to survive among foreign ruins. But even more revealing was what he found on the back of the sheet. A handwritten note, probably by a supervisor. It read, "He has developed an uncanny sense of memory. Ija remembers voices. He repeats phrases. He locks himself away with recordings and can accurately imitate tones. Perhaps useful for archiving or communication work. Remarkable potential." Poirot closed the file gently. There you have it. The final irony. The young man who was manipulated by a voice was a child raised among echoes and recordings. Back in London, Poirot received an unexpected note. The sender was Vivian Willoughby. It read, "I've given up my theatrical career. I'm teaching literature at a girls' school in Bath. But I found a poem among my aunt's things, unsigned. I think it was his. You might be interested." The poem was attached on a folded piece of paper. "If I talk, I get lost. If I remain silent, I am nobody. But if someone remembers me without my name, then I have lived." Poirot read those lines over and over again. Then he took out his notebook and wrote. The crime was stopped. The story was understood. But the boy didn't want to be found, only understood, like an echo that doesn't ask to be spoken, only to be heard, like a name that doesn't demand to be spoken, only to be remembered. A week later, in a small library in Avignon, an envelope with no return address was discreetly placed on the cataloguing desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You were heard. You were understood. No one needs to say your name. Your story is already part of a bigger one. The young librarian read it, and this time he didn't smile. This time he cried, but not out of sadness. Rather, it was because someone, somewhere, had understood the exact pain of not knowing if they had been loved, and had responded with tenderness. In London, Poirot was preparing for his next case. He filed the Willoughby papers in his file classified as finished business not closed, because not everything that ends finds closure, and not all justice is measured in convictions. As he placed the last envelope in the drawer, he muttered, "It's not a Dios, it's an echo." And the echo, he thought, is all that remains when everything else has been said. Chapter 13. Where Silence Begins. One December morning, when the fog still clung to the iron railings of Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot received a silent visitor. Not a doorbell, not a letter, just an envelope carefully placed on his doormat. There was no return address. It was sealed with grey wax, without any emblem or signature. Just a name written in firm, sober handwriting. Mr. Poirot, the detective, took it with calm hands. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The story has been read, understood, but it wasn't complete. I too lied, Monsieur Poirot. Not about who I am, but about what I did. When I went to Greystone Rise, I wasn't going just for an answer. I was going to offer the truth. But she wouldn't see it. She asked me to leave. She told me my memory was enough. I didn't get angry. I just obeyed. The night he died wasn't that far away. Poirot remained motionless. The text continued. I didn't turn on the gramophone. I didn't go into the house. But I saw the window. I saw the lamp come on. I saw it go out again. Then I saw someone come out the side door. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't Leonie. Era Penhaligon. Poirot sat down. His breathing remained calm, but his gaze sharpened again, like that of a watchmaker who discovers a misplaced spring in a mechanism he had already assumed to be adjusted. Hours later, Poirot visited Inspector Garraway at Scotland Yard. He requested access to the surveillance records from Stroud Railway Station the day before Lady Margaret's death. He then requested call records from the nearest telephone exchange to the property. Finally, he requested a review of Alistair Penhaligon's official statement. "What are you looking for, Poirot?" Garraway asked. "Haven't we already settled this?" "No, my friend," replied Poirot. "We considered it solved, but now we have a new piece. And the pieces don't just fit on the surface, but in depth." That evening, Poirot returned home with a folder under his arm. Inside, the telephone records revealed a call made to Leonie Durand's country house from a number registered to Penhaligon at exactly 7:47 p.m. on the day of the death. A 48-second call, long enough to say, it's done. She's alone. Short, enough to say nothing more. The next day, Poirot travelled to Holloway Prison, where Madame Léonie was awaiting trial. He introduced himself as a legal visitor, and was greeted with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "What are you here for, Monsieur Poirot? To make sure I still have some unconfessed guilt? No, madame," he said calmly. "I've come to free you from a situation that doesn't belong to you." He took the letter from his pocket and slid it across the table. Léonie read it silently. As she skimmed the lines, her face hardened. In the end, she didn't speak. She just placed one hand on the paper, Poirot. Waited. Finally, she looked up. "Do you mean I was manipulated? You mean, madame, that both of you were. You because of your maternal instinct, he because of his ambition. But only one of you moved the pieces with full awareness of the exact moment. And it wasn't you." Léonie leaned back in her chair, defeated. "So," he turned on his voice. Poirot nodded. "He did it. He waited for you to leave. He used the copy of the message. He knew how to activate fear. Then he came back, pretending to know nothing. Because for men like him, control isn't a tool, it's a necessity." Léonie closed her eyes. For the first time, she looked human. Days later, in the Scotland Yard interrogation room, Alistair Penhaligon was summoned again. This time, not as a witness. "We found your voice, monsieur," said Poirot. "Not in the record, but in the decisions." Penhaligon remained silent, but finally he exhaled. "I didn't think I'd die. I just wanted me to be afraid, to stop the signing, the foundation. It was all that was left of me." Poirot looked at him with hard compassion. And that's why he took away the only thing left of her: forgiveness. That night, Poirot walked across Waterloo Bridge. He watched the water flow beneath the city, indifferent to the passing of names, voices, and truths. He took the anonymous letter out of his pocket, held it for a moment, and let it fly. The paper spun, floated, and fell, not to be destroyed, but to become part of the silence where it all began, and where, perhaps, it was all meant to end. Chapter 14. A Faceless Witness. Winter was settling slowly over London, bringing with it a heavy greyness that seemed to hang over the rooftops like a lead blanket. The streetlights cast an anemic glow over the damp sidewalks, and the clocks at the stations became dull echoes of passing time. Hercule Poirot, bundled up in his immaculate dark coat and black leather gloves, silently crossed the threshold of a small private medical records office on a quiet street in Bloomsbury. He had made an appointment with Dr. Elaine Brodie, a specialist in psychological medicine who had worked for years as a consultant for various charities, including the Willoughby Foundation. "Thank you for seeing me, Doctor," Poirot said as he sat down with geometric precision. "It's a delicate matter." The doctor, a petite woman with grey hair tied in a simple bun, offered her a slight smile. Her eyes were intelligent and discreet. "I'm aware of the case, Monsieur Poirot. How may I help you?" Poirot opened his notebook. "Do you remember a young man named Antoine R., perhaps registered under various pseudonyms, who was treated at the Maison de l'Espoir?" The doctor nodded after a brief pause. "Yes, they called him Echo Boy. We never learned his real last name. He was very quiet at first, but he had a prodigious auditory memory. He repeated exact phrases, even from conversations he'd only heard. Once, we referred him to a technical training school in Paris. We lost contact shortly after. Poirot crossed his arms. Do you remember if he mentioned any maternal figures? Just once. He said, "She looked at me without seeing me." We never knew who he was referring to. Poirot nodded gravely. "Thank you, Doctor. You've confirmed what I suspected. The boy wasn't running away from his story. He was running away from the reflection that story offered him, and yet he couldn't help but return." That afternoon, Poirot returned to Whitehaven Mansions and placed 3 objects on his desk, the vinyl record with the reconstructed voice, the Willoughby signet ring, the anonymous letter signed only with AA. These 3 elements, when viewed together, seem to form a silent symphony. Not a crime in the traditional sense, but a fractured history that cried out for recognition rather than justice. Then Poirot did something he hadn't done for a long time. "Boudican," wrote a letter, Mr. A. "You told me you didn't want to be found, and I won't look for you. But let me send you something more valuable than a will, an inheritance, or a surname. I send you the assurance that you were heard, that your story, despite the darkness, found clarity, and that the actions of others, no matter how hard they tried to define you, were no more powerful than your chosen silence. If you ever decide to speak out, you won't need proof. You'll just have to tell what you saw, what you heard, because no one has done it more accurately than you. And if you never decide to do so, you'll know that your voice has already been written in the margins of this story. With eternal respect, H. Poirot, he put the letter in a white envelope without an address. He left it on the mantelpiece in his living room where other objects were waiting. Then he turned off the lamp. Weeks later, in a provincial library in Avignon, an unstamped envelope was hand-delivered to the young librarian by a stranger in a dark suit. The man didn't speak. He just smiled, bowed his head slightly, and walked away without looking back. The young man opened the envelope. He read the letter, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit down without homework, without a notebook, without pretending to be busy, just to breathe. In London, Poirot was preparing his suitcase for a new case in Suffolk. As he arranged his shirts, he paused in front of a small framed photograph on the dresser. It was Lady Margaret Willoughby in her youth with her husband at a charity event. Her eyes seemed to smile shyly. But now Poirot knew that even then, behind that gesture, a decision was already brewing that would shape a lifetime. "Madame," he whispered, "your crime was not speaking, but your punishment was wanting to speak. Too late." Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, and with it, the last traces of the Willoughby case. But like every great mystery, it didn't disappear. It only faded into a deeper place, where faceless voices, unspoken names, and buried memories continued to live in the echo of each chosen silence. Chapter 15. The voice that wasn't on the record. A few days later, already settled into his modest accommodation in Suffolk, Poirot received a phone call. It wasn't from Inspector Garraway, nor from Scotland Yard, nor even from a regular client. It was from Mrs. Rowena Aldbridge. "Monsieur Poirot," he said gravely, "I'm not calling out of courtesy. It's about something you should be aware of. I've Reviewed the Foundation's audio logs, as you suggested. I found something that doesn't add up. What kind of thing, madam? A recording. It wasn't listed. It doesn't have a label, and it's not made with the same technology as the rest. It's more recent, much clearer. But in it, you can hear a conversation, not a reading, not a letter. A real conversation between Lady Margaret and someone else. Poirot returned to London that same night. He took a train without stopping to pack anything other than his briefcase. When he arrived at the Aldbridge residence, the lady was waiting for him in an oak-panelled library, her expression as tense as it was respectful. A tape recorder was spinning on the table. Rowena loaded the tape, adjusted the head and pressed play. At first, only the background hum could be heard. Then, Lady Margaret's voice. "I don't want to hide it any more, Alistair. I've lived my whole life between closed rooms." A silence followed. Then a tense, familiar male voice. "What you want doesn't matter now, Margaret. There are institutions, names, people who depend on your discretion, on your silence." Poirot leaned forward. It was Penhaligon's voice, but not read, not reconstructed, not edited, real, dialoguing. Lady Margaret replied, "So this will be the last thing I say in silence, but it will be mine, not yours." A faint sound of footsteps, then something tipped over, perhaps a glass. A distant door slammed. End of tape. Poirot stood still. He placed his fingertips on his lips. This changes, not the conclusion of the case, but its essence. It wasn't just induced fear. It was an attempt at freedom, which was intercepted. "So Penhaligon knew she was recording him?" Rowena asked. Poirot shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. This tape was hidden, not archived. She recorded it for security, in case the truth didn't outlive her word." Later, Poirot took the tape to Scotland Yard. Inspector Garraway listened to it sternly. He took notes. He asked questions. But when he finished, he simply said, "It doesn't change the fact that she died without direct physical intervention. Fear-mongering remains the basis of the charges." "Yes," Poirot admitted, "but now we have something else. Proof that she broke silence. She tried to speak, and she was silenced not with a scream, but with a strategy." Garraway looked at him silently. Then he nodded. "I'll note it in the file, although I doubt it will influence the trial. Perhaps not," Poirot said gently. "But it will be read by those who need to know that she was not a weak woman. She was a woman who, in the end, chose to say something, even though no one wanted to hear it." A few days later, Poirot returned to his apartment. The package was waiting on his desk. There was no return address, but the paper was identical to the first letter he had received from the nameless young man. Inside this time, there was no letter, just a recording. Poirot put the tape in his small player. He pressed play. "I didn't respond before because I didn't know if it was safe. But you protected me even without knowing it. My name doesn't matter anymore. But I've started writing. Not my story, but that of others. People without a voice. People with similar silences. Sometimes justice doesn't come from punishment. It comes from testimony. You made my story seem more than just a phantom. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." A. Poirot closed his eyes, not out of tiredness, but to let the voice reach not his mind, but his heart. That recording was not evidence. It was a seed. The next day, Poirot walked slowly to his desk. In his notebook, he wrote the last note on the case. Justice doesn't always close doors. Sometimes it opens them ajar. Justice isn't what is punished, but what is acknowledged. In the echo of a hidden tape, a woman found her voice. In the echo of an erased childhood, a young man found dignity, and in the middle, an invisible crime was finally exposed to light. Poirot signed with his initial. He closed the notebook, and he let the silence speak for him. Chapter 16. Where time does not erase. A month later, in the middle of January, the cold descended upon London like a silent verdict. The streets were covered in a fine frost, and the streetlights lit up early, as if they suspected the day would never truly dawn. Hercule Poirot walked slowly through Brompton Cemetery. He was dressed in immaculate black, his bowler hat slightly tilted. His gloves shod like an extension of his judgment. This wasn't a routine visit. This wasn't mourning. It was compliance. In front of him, a modest tombstone, Lady Margaret Willoughby. Silence can hide love, but it can never erase it. The epitaph had been modified, discreetly, at the suggestion of Vivian Willoughby, who, now more reserved and less prone to dramatization, had understood that her aunt, despite her coldness, had harboured a kind of compassion she didn't know how to express out loud. Poirot left only one object on the grave, a recording, not a copy of the voice-induced disc, nor of the tape of the conversation with Penhaligon. It was something else. One he had edited himself with the help of a sound technician. It contained a single fragment. It wasn't a mistake. It was an absence. But absences also teach us lessons. And I've learned. The young man's voice. Poirot knew no one would listen. It wasn't for the ears of the living. It was an offering to a conscience that could no longer change the facts, but which, perhaps, still sought reconciliation beyond time. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot found a new letter. It came from a law firm in Lyon. It didn't mention the Willoughby case or inheritance. It was a simple request. Monsieur Poirot, a group of young people without families have asked you to visit them. They've read about you. They've heard that you helped someone like them. They don't know your name, but they think you'll understand. Poirot read it silently. Then, without saying a word, he reached for his suitcase. He carefully folded his 3-button waistcoat, his neatly ironed shirts, and his pearly grey tie. He added his notebook. Before closing it, he placed an envelope inside. It was white, unstamped, and with no return address. The same envelope that had been handed to him by the name of A.A. A reminder, not from one case, but of a purpose. The train departed for France at dawn. Poirot travelled alone, as was his custom, sitting by the window, watching the mist of the rural stations drift by like a friendly ghost. In his hands he held a book of poetry that he hadn't opened. I didn't need it. The story of Lady Margaret, of Paul, of Vivian, of Penhaligon, of that nameless boy, was not a closed novel. It was an unfinished symphony, a constant murmur, and in his mind, like an unbroken thread, echoed a phrase spoken by Lady Margaret in her recorded conversation. But this time I want my voice not to be a whisper. I want it to remain, even if it isn't heard." Poirot closed his eyes. On her small shoulders were closed cases, completed trials, memories that didn't make the papers. But in her heart, more silent than ever, she knew that this case, the one about the voice that terrorized the silent witness, hadn't been solved with logic or evidence, but with compassion. And so, as the train crossed the iron bridge over the Rhône, Poirot thought, as men who have heard too many secrets sometimes thought, that the worst crimes were not those committed with weapons, but those that were committed with forgetfulness. And that was a justice that no one asked for. Faute d'éarth, he with his little grey cells, would never leave unanswered. Chapter 17. The Mirror That Did Not Return the Face. The city of Lyon greeted him with a leaden sky and a cutting air that seemed to bite through the wool. Poirot, however, walked through the cobblestone streets with his usual composure, as if his coat was enough not only to protect him from the cold, but also from the persistent memories that followed him. He had been invited to a youth centre run by a local organisation that assists young people without families. The building was modest, a pale stone structure with low ceilings and steamed windows, but it maintained a quiet dignity that Poirot respected from the first step. A volunteer led him down a hallway to a common room where a group of young people, boys, and girls between the ages of 14 and 20 were leafing through books or writing silently. A couple of them looked at him with concealed suspicion, others with a friendly curiosity, but they all had one look in common, that of those who have learned not to ask twice. Poirot greeted with a slight nod. "Good evening, my friends." The director of the centre, a burly man with a weathered face, invited him to sit in front of a small group. One of the young men, with dark hair and round glasses, watched him intently from a corner. He didn't speak. He didn't come closer, but Poirot felt it like a familiar echo. They offered him tea. They asked questions, some trivial ones. How do you solve crimes? Does he really look at people's shoes? Does he have enemies? But then, a more timid voice from the back. Have you ever solved something that you didn't want to solve? Poirot was silent for a few seconds. Then he leaned gently forward, folding his hands on the table. Yes, a case that didn't call for justice. It called for compassion. It didn't seek revenge, but recognition. And did he succeed? It depends. Poirot tilted his head. The truth came out, but it didn't destroy. It was understood, and then she was free. The young man with glasses looked away, as if those words weren't new, but simply accurate. That evening, in the room that had been prepared for him, Poirot took the envelope containing the Willoughby ring out of his suitcase. He held it between his fingers for a moment. Then he wrote a short note in French. Not to remember a blood, but a choice. Wear it if you ever wish to be seen not for what you inherited, but for what you chose not to destroy. The next day the envelope was left on a shelf in the school's library. No name, no signature, just a destination. Poirot didn't mention it to anyone, not even the director. Before leaving, he walked through the building's backyard. There, at the Tuileries, young man with glasses was waiting for him under an eave, pretending to look through a notebook. Poirot stopped in front of him. The boy looked up. His eyes were the same as Paul Hennings's, serene, observant, tired. "Are you the one who came from England?" the young man asked, without emotion. "I'm the one who listens better than I speak," Poirot replied with a slight smile. Silence fell between them. It wasn't tense, just long. Until the young man, without raising his voice, said, "Thank you for not saying my name." Poirot nodded. "Thanks for not asking me for yours." The young man put away his notebook. Then, as if he'd been waiting for this gesture for a while, he extended his hand. "I don't know if I'm what she expected, but you made it so I never had to ask that again." Poirot shook hands firmly but gently. "And that, monsieur, is the only truth that matters." Back in London, Poirot stopped by the bookstore where he usually bought his leather-bound notebooks. He bought a new one, black, plain, untitled. On the first page he wrote, "Cases that do not seek justice, but peace." Below, a date and a word, Greystone. Then she closed the notebook and placed it among others, not on the main shelf, but in a low drawer next to a portrait of Hastings, a pressed rose, and a photograph of Greystone Rise under. The mist. Not everything had to be remembered by others. Some stories are saved, not to be told, but so that no one else has to live them again. Final chapter. The crime no one saw committed. The month of February brought with it a different clarity. The air over London was still cold, but the ice was beginning to melt from the railings, and the reflections in the windows were regaining the brilliance lost during the winter. In Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot stood at his desk, reviewing the final notes on the case that had marked his recent weeks. The death of Lady Margaret, Willoughby, the disembodied voice, the silent witness, the nameless son. In front of him, spread out on the table, were all the pieces, and although the puzzle was put together, Poirot knew that one last explanation was necessary. Not for the courts, not for Scotland Yard, but for himself, for his own need for moral symmetry and human logic. With his favourite fountain pen, he began to write one last entry in his notebook of closed cases. The crime was planned, not executed. The victim was chosen not out of weakness, but out of knowledge. The culprits were numerous, but only one wove the entire structure, and like any good architect of unarmed murder, he did it from the shadows. The crime, Poirot reflected, did not begin with the disc. It began with the letter, the one Lady Margaret received from A, the young man who asked for neither money nor a name, but simply a meeting to understand if he was ever remembered. Lady Margaret, torn between a desire for redemption and fear of scandal, hesitated. That hesitation was seen by Alistair Penhaligon. He understood that if Lady Margaret publicly acknowledged the boy, the will would change. The Willoughby Trust would lose its purpose, and he, his power, his legacy. But Penhaligon, shrewd and methodical, did not get his hands dirty. He orchestrated a chain of psychological manipulations. He used Léonie Durand, who, unaware of the full plan, agreed to help him for fear of exposing the son she had kept hidden, to arrange the recording. He reconstructed the voice. He placed it on the gramophone in the office. He waited until Lady Margaret was alone. He activated the device. Fear did the rest. And then, like the actor who leaves through the back door as the curtain falls, he returned feigning neutrality, kindness, surprise. But Poirot, with his usual precision, pieced together each thread. The phone calls made by Penhaligon to Leonie's home on the day of her death. The modified will was filed in a second administrative file without informing anyone. The hidden tape where Lady Margaret was heard threatening to reveal the truth, and Penhaligon's voice suggesting she keep silent for the good of everyone. All carefully measured, and yet one variable escaped him. A silent presence in the garden. Paul Hennings, the silent witness. The man who didn't hear voices but the gestures of fear, and who, in the end, trusted Poirot. On his last visit to Greystone Rise, Poirot gathered the family's lawyers, Vivian Willoughby, and representatives of the Foundation. Leonie had confessed her involvement. Penhaligon had been arrested, charges of willful tampering resulting in death, but Poirot needed to close the moral loop. Lady Margaret made mistakes, yes, he said, standing in the centre of the room, where it had all begun. But in her final days, she tried to remedy them. She tried to speak. She tried to write. And she was silenced. Her will was intercepted not by fate, but by ego. He turned to Vivienne. Mademoiselle, your aunt left more than just documents. She left an intention, that her fortune be used to repair, not to shield. Vivian, her eyes moist, nodded silently. And so it was decided to create a new branch of the Willoughby Foundation, a school and centre for young people without family or surname, whose initial name would be simply The Voice, not by a voice that shouted, but for the one that, having been silenced, would now be heard in others. Back in London, Poirot closed his notebook with a ceremonious gesture. He had written everything down. The crime, the motives, the mistakes. But on the last page he wrote a single sentence. Not all murderers carry a knife. Some only know fear, and know when to drop it. He turned off the lamp. He went to the window. The city was still alive, unperturbed, as if it had never heard of Lady Margaret, Paul, Allen, or Penhaligon. But Poirot knew, and that knowledge was his form of justice, because, in the end, he didn't solve cases to gain fame, but so that the voices that the world would rather forget did not die in vain.